With a voice that could move mountains and a smile that lit up the world, Dolly Parton became America's eternal sweetheart. The queen of country music, the woman behind timeless anthems like Jolene and I Will Always Love You. But behind the rhinestones, the laughter, and the perfect blonde curls lived a secret storm that fame could never silence. She sang of love and freedom, yet quietly battled pain, heartbreak, and a darkness that almost ended her life. Few knew of the night she held a gun in her hand, or the invisible wounds left by the fame she built. What truly broke the woman who made the world believe in joy? In this video, we uncover the full, never-before-told truth about Dolly Parton. Her hidden battles, her emotional scars, and the tragic price she paid to become a living legend. Before she was a star wrapped in sequins, Dolly Rebecca Parton was just a barefoot girl from the misty hills of Sevier County, Tennessee. One of 12 children crammed inside a one-room cabin with no electricity, no plumbing, and often no food. Her lullabies weren't sung from a record player. They were the sound of rain leaking through the tin roof and her mother's trembling voice trying to drown out hunger with hymns. Her father, Robert Lee Parton, was a man of pride and silence. Hard-working, illiterate, and haunted by the shame of poverty. He loved his children in the only way he knew, through survival. But to young Dolly, that love felt distant, locked behind a wall of exhaustion. Her mother, A.V. Lee, filled the void with songs of faith, stitching melodies into Dolly's heart like patchwork quilts. Yet, in those hymns lived a warning that ambition could be sinful, that pride was the devil's whisper. When Dolly began singing in local churches, her voice carried a haunting maturity that made grown men cry. But behind the applause was tension. Neighbors whispered that she dressed too bold. Her grandfather, a strict preacher, scolded her for vanity, even whipping her for wearing lipstick. That sting left more than a mark on her skin. It carved a lifelong scar of guilt, making her question whether beauty and faith could ever coexist. As a teenager, she'd stare into a broken mirror, practicing smiles she didn't yet feel, promising herself that one day she'd escape these hills. Not to abandon them, but to prove that someone like her could shine without shame. Each time her family told her to be realistic, she wrote another song, another promise on paper. Music became her rebellion, her prayer, and her only form of control in a world where poverty dictated every breath. The stage lights she chased would one day blind her. But in those quiet Tennessee nights, Dolly didn't yet know that her hunger for love, approval, and freedom would become both her salvation and her curse. The fire that would build her empire, and the wound that would never heal. The day Dolly Parton stepped off the Greyhound bus in Nashville, she was 18, wearing a yellow dress her mother had sewn by hand and clutching a cardboard suitcase full of dreams. The city smelled of ambition and whiskey. Within hours, she realized talent alone wasn't currency. Innocence was. Record executives smiled too long, promised too much, and mistook her politeness for permission. But Dolly was nobody's fool. Behind the soft accent was a sharp instinct. She learned early how to weaponize charm without surrendering her power. Her first years in Nashville were brutal. Songs were stolen, contracts twisted, and men laughed at her hillbilly glamour. But in 1967, fate came disguised as an invitation from Porter Wagoner, a country star with a national TV show. Joining him meant exposure, fame, and chains. He called her the little girl with the big voice, and on stage, they looked like a duet made in heaven. Off stage, it was a silent war of control. He owned the spotlight, the set list, even the tempo of her laughter. For 7 years, she endured the push and pull of admiration and manipulation until she finally did what no woman in Nashville dared. She left. That goodbye became her greatest act of defiance. She poured her heartbreak into a song. I Will Always Love You. The melody was tender, but its message was liberation. It wasn't just a farewell to Porter. It was Dolly's emancipation from an industry that measured women by obedience. The song topped the country charts twice, and decades later, Whitney Houston would make it immortal. But in 1974, it was simply a woman's quiet revolution. Freedom, however, came with exile. Nashville turned its back, calling her ungrateful. Determined not to fade, Dolly crossed over to pop, a move critics mocked as career suicide. She smiled anyway. Her 1,977 album Here You Come Again shattered expectations, selling over 2 million copies and winning her a Grammy. Suddenly, the hillbilly girl was on The Tonight Show, shaking hands with presidents and movie producers. Hollywood came next. 9 to 5 980 made her a global icon. Actress, composer, comedian. The film's title track became an anthem for working women and sold over 5 million copies, but fame carried a price she never predicted. Paparazzi swarmed, tabloids speculated, and the Dolly the world adored was becoming a persona she could barely maintain. Every rhinestone dress, every larger-than-life wig became armor to protect the fragile girl, still searching for validation. The irony was cruel. The more she shone, the lonelier she felt. Friends noticed her exhaustion, but Dolly buried it under relentless work. Her schedule was punishing. 250 shows a year, film deals, studio sessions, and endless interviews. Sleep became optional. Meals turned to coffee and protein shakes. Behind her laughter, her body was breaking. Yet, even in the storm, she refused to let them see her bleed. When reporters mocked her looks, she'd smile and fire back. It costs a lot to look this cheap. It was a joke and a shield. She transformed mockery into art, reclaiming the narrative before anyone else could weaponize it. By the early 1980 seconds, Dolly Parton had conquered every medium. Music, film, television. She had earned 7 Grammys, 25 top 10 hits, and a net worth climbing past $50 million. Numbers staggering for a woman from the Smoky Mountains. But numbers couldn't measure what she'd lost in the process: privacy, rest, and peace of mind. Some nights, after standing ovations and flashing cameras, she would go home to silence so deep it hurt. She once said, "I'm surrounded by people, but I've never felt more alone." That loneliness would soon grow teeth. The fame she fought for all her life was beginning to devour her. Piece by piece, smile by smile, she had built an empire of music and hope, but beneath its glittering surface, cracks were forming. Silent, invisible, inevitable. The same fire that lifted her from poverty was now threatening to burn everything she'd built. And when it finally did, the explosion would leave scars she could never hide again. By the time the 1980 seconds dawned, Dolly Parton was untouchable. Or so it seemed. She was selling out arenas, hosting primetime specials, and flashing that unshakable smile America adored. But in the quiet corners of her mansion in Brentwood, that smile often cracked. The truth was simple and devastating. She had everything, except the feeling of being truly seen. Her marriage to Carl Dean, the man she married back in 1966, was a paradox. Invisible to the world, yet anchored deep in her soul. Carl hated the spotlight and avoided it like disease. He rarely attended her events, never appeared on red carpets, and refused interviews. To outsiders, it looked like an arrangement. To Dolly, it was a mystery she never solved. She called him a loner, a man who likes his peace. But peace is a fragile thing when one heart beats under stadium lights and the other hides in the shadows. The distance grew with fame. Weeks turned to months of silence, missed dinners, and empty hotel rooms. Carl's absence became a ghost haunting her success. Dolly filled that void the only way she knew. With work. But the harder she ran, the more the loneliness followed. It gets mighty lonesome when you're surrounded by people who only see what you represent, she once confessed. During this emotional drought came what she would later describe as an affair of the heart. It wasn't about passion or lust, but connection, the kind she had been starving for. The man, a musician and close collaborator, offered her empathy when she was most fragile. Their relationship blurred the line between friendship and need. And when it collapsed, the fallout was catastrophic. She spiraled into exhaustion and despair, her body breaking under the weight of sleepless nights and constant touring. Then came the illness. Endometriosis. Severe abdominal pain, internal bleeding, doctors' warnings ignored until her body gave out. She was forced to cancel shows, undergo surgery, and face a reality she could no longer control. The loss of her ability to have children hit like a silent avalanche. It was an awful time for me, she admitted later, her voice trembling. The woman who had once defied Nashville now found herself defeated by her own flesh. But perhaps the darkest moment arrived not in a hospital bed, but in her bedroom. Late one night, overwhelmed by guilt and heartbreak, Dolly reached for a gun. The headlines never knew, the world never saw. She wrote later that she held it in her hand, ready to end the pain, when her little dog Popeye jumped into her lap. A simple act that broke the spell. She put the gun down and prayed until dawn. That night changed everything. In the weeks that followed, Dolly retreated from the public eye. She turned down interviews, avoided cameras, and surrounded herself with silence. She began meditating, reading scripture, and finding solace in prayer. Slowly, her voice, the one that once lifted millions, began healing her again. Out of the wreckage came songs like Starting Over Again and Eagle When She Flies, written not from ambition, but survival. The tabloids continued their cruelty, calling her a cartoon of femininity, mocking her body, her wigs, her laugh. Each insult cut deeper than the last. But Dolly, ever the alchemist, turned pain into performance. She reinvented her image. Part saint, part showgirl, and wrapped her wounds in glitter. And yet, beneath every rhinestone and smile, she carried a secret ache. For the children she never had, for the love she couldn't sustain, for the part of herself she had to bury to keep shining. In the grand theater of fame, her tragedy was not that she fell, but that she had to fall in silence. No one watching her on stage in those years would have guessed how close she came to disappearing entirely. The applause was thunder, her heart barely whispered. That was the price of being Dolly Parton, the woman who made the world believe in light, even when she was drowning in darkness. When the lights dimmed after another sold-out show in the mid-1980 seconds, Dolly Parton walked off stage to a silence heavier than applause. Her sequined gown sparkled under the dressing room bulbs, but her reflection was almost unrecognizable. Pale, exhausted, and trembling. Her doctor's voice echoed in her mind. If you don't slow down, your body will make you his way, and deferent. It already had. Years of relentless touring and emotional turmoil had culminated in the diagnosis that would break her spirit. endometriosis, a painful disorder that had silently eaten away at her strength. Ignoring the symptoms for months, she collapsed backstage one evening, writhing in pain while her team debated whether to cancel the tour. Soon after, surgeons performed a partial hysterectomy, ending her hopes of ever having children. The woman who had mothered entire audiences with her songs was suddenly stripped of the chance to be one in her own home. "I went into a deep, dark place," she would later admit. Depression, insomnia, and anxiety crept into every waking hour. Some mornings, she couldn't rise from bed. Others, she forced herself into rehearsals, smiling through tears hidden behind mascara. Those who saw her during that time said she seemed present but hollow, as if her body showed up, but her soul stayed behind. The physical recovery was slow, the emotional one nearly impossible. Her hormones fluctuated violently, leaving her irritable, fog-minded, and withdrawn. She began to eat compulsively, gaining weight and losing confidence. Then, as quickly as the binging started, she starved herself again, chasing control over a body that had betrayed her. One night, staring at her reflection, she whispered, "You gave everything, and it still wasn't enough." "I his way, and different." Hollywood didn't care. Producers kept calling, expecting the same effervescent Dolly. She obliged, filming, recording, performing, even as her health declined. By 1987, she was surviving on adrenaline, caffeine, and sheer willpower. Friends described her as running on faith and fumes. "I his way, and different." But something shifted after the night of the gun and Popeye. The night death blinked first. Dolly realized she couldn't rebuild the same life. She had to reinvent it. She sold several properties, canceled tours, and retreated into the Smoky Mountains where her story began. There, surrounded by the whispering pines of her childhood, she confronted the ghosts she had outrun for decades: the poverty, the sermons, the whip, the silence. What emerged from that solitude was not despair. It was purpose. If she couldn't have children, she would raise generations through knowledge and kindness. In 1995, she founded the Imagination Library, a literacy program that began in her hometown. The idea was simple. Every child, regardless of income, would receive a free book each month from birth to age 5. What started as 1,000 books a year soon became over 200 million books worldwide, reaching families in more than 5 countries. It was Dolly's quiet rebellion against the illiteracy that had once shamed her father. "Daddy couldn't read or write," she said, "but he lived long enough to see kids get their books. That made him prouder than anything I ever sang." A-way, to pre-8, end-9. Her music, too, began to mirror her transformation. Gone were the sugary pop gloss and the performative sparkle. In their place came introspection. Songs like "Eagle When She Flies" and "Light of a Clear Blue Morning," hymns of survival rather than success. Critics called it her rebirth era. But Dolly wasn't chasing a comeback, she was chasing peace. Still, the 1,990 seconds demanded more of her. New generations mocked her look, calling her a relic of old Nashville. She laughed it off publicly, but privately wrestled with insecurity. To maintain her image, she underwent cosmetic procedures. Not out of vanity, but out of fear that fading beauty would mean fading worth. "It costs a lot to look this cheap," she quipped, turning self-deprecation into a shield. But behind the humor lay a truth. Every touch-up was a negotiation between identity and expectation. Then came a different kind of redemption. One forged not in spotlight, but in service. Dollywood, the theme park she built in Pigeon Forge, became an empire of its own, employing thousands and generating over 3 million visitors annually. Yet, for Dolly, it wasn't a monument to fame. It was a sanctuary for working families like the one she grew up in. Employees called her the boss who still hugs, a woman who remembered every janitor's name and paid for their children's college tuition. Her generosity expanded beyond Tennessee. When wildfires ravaged her home region in 2016, Dolly donated over $10 million to rebuild homes and communities. During the COVID-19 pandemic, she quietly contributed $1 million to vaccine research, a gesture that helped fund Moderna's development. The world saw a country singer. History saw a humanitarian. But what truly astonished her fans was not her charity. It was her serenity. The woman who once stood on the edge of despair now spoke openly about faith, forgiveness, and self-worth. "I've made peace with the parts of me I used to hate," she told an interviewer. "I learned you can't shine until you accept your own shadows." 21's, as she aged, Dolly defied gravity. Not just cosmetically, but spiritually. She became an emblem of endurance, of how beauty can coexist with pain. When asked if she ever regretted not having children, she smiled softly. "I have millions. They just don't all call me mama." 24's10. Today, in her late 70s, she still records, still writes, still laughs like a child of the mountains. The world continues to see her as a legend, a caricature, a miracle wrapped in glitter. But the truth beneath it all is quieter, humbler, and infinitely braver. Dolly Parton didn't conquer the world because she was fearless. She conquered it because she faced her fears. Illness, heartbreak, ridicule, loneliness. And kept singing anyway. And perhaps that is her final revelation. That survival isn't the absence of pain, but the decision to create beauty in spite of it. The girl from the Smoky Mountains built an empire of joy out of her own sorrow. A reminder to everyone who ever loved her music that even the brightest light comes from the darkest place.